pack your bags, Julian. Your 49% shares are now worth exactly $1 under the default clause, and your employment with Cross Health is terminated immediately. Sterling Thorne, the managing partner of Vanguard Capital, tossed the folder across the mahogany table. Next to him, my former co-founder, David Vance, looked at the floor, refusing to meet my eyes. I did not yell. I did not make a scene. I looked at the termination notice, picked up my black ballpoint pen, and signed it. I stood up, buttoned my navy suit jacket, and walked out. They thought they had just taken my company. They forgot who owned the core patent. The morning sun reflected off the windows of the LaSalle Street skyscrapers as I walked toward the train station. I was 46 years old, and for the last 8 years, Cross Health Solutions had been my entire life. I had built the technology from scratch, line by line, while David handled the sales and the client relationships. We started in a cramped office in the West Loop, surviving on cheap coffee and frozen meals, writing code while the rest of Chicago slept. Our breakthrough was MetaRoute, a proprietary transaction routing algorithm. In simple terms, when a hospital submits a medical claim to an insurance company, the transaction must pass through multiple validation gateways, compliance checks, and format translations. In the early days of digital healthcare, this process took days and suffered from high error rates due to incompatible legacy formats. I spent 2 years developing MetaRoute to solve this. It was a beautiful piece of engineering, utilizing dynamic XML payload translation, real-time PostgreSQL validation, and automated HIPAA compliance logging. It reduced claim processing times from 72 hours to less than 4 seconds. Before we incorporated Cross Health Solutions, I knew the value of what I had created. I registered United States Patent 9843, 2111 for the MetaRoute database routing architecture under my personal name. When David and I officially formed the company, our attorney suggested we assign all intellectual property to the new corporate entity. I refused. I was willing to assign the specific application code I wrote during my employment, but the underlying patented algorithm was my safety net. Instead of an assignment, we drafted a patent license agreement. It was a non-exclusive, commercial license that granted Cross Health Solutions the right to use the patented MetaRoute architecture. I charged the company a nominal fee of $1 per year. I was a co-founder and 50-50 shareholder, so I wanted the business to succeed without being weighed down by licensing fees. However, I insisted on inserting Clause 14C into the license agreement. It was a standard protective measure for a founding developer. Clause 14C stated that the patent license was strictly non-transferable and would immediately terminate if my employment with Cross Health was terminated for any reason other than voluntary resignation, or if there was a change of control where the company was acquired without my written approval. David didn't object back then. We were partners, and he assumed we would run the company together forever. For the first 6 years, we did. Cross Health grew from a 2-man startup to a dominant player in the regional healthcare sector. We integrated our platform with major hospital groups across Illinois, Indiana, and Wisconsin. By the 7th year, MetaRoute was processing over 300,000 medical claims daily, generating $22 million in annual recurring revenue. But wealth changes people. As the revenue numbers climbed, David started spending less time in the office and more time at country clubs. He bought a house in Lake Forest and a yacht in Harbor Springs. He began hanging out with private equity brokers who whispered in his ear about multi-million-dollar exit valuations. He started seeing the company not as a technological solution we built to help hospitals, but as an asset to be flipped. I, on the other hand, remained focused on the technology. I spent my days in our server room, managing our AWS API gateway endpoints and optimizing our database indexes. I knew every line of code, every database schema, and every network configuration. I knew that our systems were held together by the efficiency of MetaRoute. Without it, the application would collapse under the weight of the massive transaction volume. 6 months ago, David introduced me to Sterling Thorne. Vanguard Capital was a private equity firm known for buying mid-sized tech companies, gutting the staff, and selling the remaining shell for a quick profit. Sterling was a tall, smooth-talking predator who wore bespoke three-piece suits and carried himself with the arrogance of a man who had never faced a real consequence in his life. Sterling wanted to buy a 51% controlling stake in CrossHealth Solutions. He promised that Vanguard's resources would allow us to scale nationally and eventually take the company public. I was highly skeptical. I told David that private equity firms like Vanguard did not care about the product or the employees. They cared about the multiples. I voted against the transaction, but David had already made his choice. Under our corporate bylaws, a sale of control required a simple majority of outstanding shares. Since we were 50-50 partners, we were deadlocked. Or so I thought. What I did not know was that David had spent the previous month transferring 2% of his shares to his brother, Ryan Vance, who then voted in favor of the Vanguard deal. David had bypassed our deadlock by diluting his own voting power to create a three-way shareholder structure that favored the acquisition. The transaction closed and Vanguard Capital took control. They immediately replaced our board of directors, leaving David as a figurehead CEO and appointing Sterling Thorne as the chairman. I was demoted from chief technology officer to chief software architect. I was stripped of my voting rights, but I still held 49% of the company's equity, which was valued at $15 million under the acquisition prospectus. For the first few weeks, the new management left me alone. They needed me to oversee the integration of our API endpoints with their new BulletBrain port. But I could see the writing on the wall. Sterling brought in a team of young analysts who started questioning our operational costs. They complained about the salaries of our senior developers. They wanted to replace our local engineering team with cheap offshore contractors. I stood my ground, defending my team and refusing to compromise on security or system stability. This made me a target. Sterling did not like employees who talked back, especially ones who owned 49% of the company. He knew that under our shareholder agreement, if I remained employed for 12 months after the acquisition, my shares would become fully vested and liquid, allowing me to sell them or force a corporate buyout. They wanted my shares, but they did not want to pay $15 million for them. So, they decided to find a way to take them for nothing. They began looking for a reason to terminate my employment for cause. In our shareholder agreement, there was a predatory default clause. If a founder was terminated for cause, due to a breach of fiduciary duty or professional misconduct, the company had the right to claw back their unvested shares for a nominal payment of $1. I did not know the trap they were laying for me. I simply went to work every day, focused on keeping the servers running and the claims processing. I did not realize that David and Sterling were already working behind closed doors, compiling a list of fabricated violations to strip me of my life's work. It all went down on a rainy Thursday afternoon. I was in the middle of diagnosing a slow query log on our production database when my phone buzzed. It was an automated calendar invite for an urgent meeting in the main conference room. The title was simply Operational Review. When I entered the room, the atmosphere was cold. Sterling Thorne sat at the head of the long table, flanked by the company's corporate counsel, a sharp-faced attorney named Arthur Vance. No relation to David, but a ruthless defender of Vanguard's interests. David Vance himself was sitting near the corner, his eyes fixed on a notepad, fidgeting with a silver pen. I sat down, pulling out my laptop. "What is the issue?" I asked, looking at Sterling. "We have a database replication lag on the Indiana gateway, and I need to get back to the console." "The database can wait." "Julian," Sterling said, his voice dripping with condescension, "we have some very serious matters to discuss regarding your conduct and your future with this company." Arthur Vance slid a thick blue folder across the polished wood. I opened it and saw a compilation of printed emails, server logs, and code repository commits. "Over the past 3 months," Sterling began, leaning forward, "you have repeatedly used company resources, including proprietary servers and AWS accounts, to host and develop software that is not owned by CrossHealth Solutions. Specifically, you have been running a secondary database instance containing patient information for an independent clinic in Lake County." I looked at the server logs. This is absurd. That database instance is a staging environment we set up 3 years ago to test our HL7 message parsers. It uses dummy patient data that I generated using a script. It was created with David's full knowledge and approval so we could demonstrate the system to prospective clients. I looked at David. David, you were there when we set this up. We used it for the Northwestern Mutual presentation. David did not look up. He cleared his throat. I don't recall approving the use of production servers for external testing, Julian. The logs show that this test instance has been active on our primary AWS tenant, costing the company thousands in hosting fees. It costs $12 a month, I said, my voice rising slightly. It is an idle database micro-instance. You know exactly what this is. Regardless of your excuses, Julian, Sterling interrupted, raising a hand to silence me. Using corporate resources for unauthorized external projects is a direct violation of Section 8 of your employment agreement. It constitutes a breach of fiduciary duty and professional misconduct. In short, it is grounds for immediate termination for cause. This is a fabricated setup, I said, closing the folder. You want to bypass the 12-month vesting period for my shares. You want to trigger the clawback clause. We are simply enforcing the contract that you signed, Arthur Vance said smoothly. Under Section 11B of the shareholder agreement, termination for cause allows the company to repurchase your 49% stake for a nominal fee of $1. Here is the termination notice and the share repurchase agreement. He pushed 2 documents toward me, along with a cheap plastic pen. I looked at David again. His face was flushed, but he remained silent. He had sold out his partner of 8 years for a bigger payout from Vanguard. If they clawed back my shares, David's remaining equity would increase in value, as Vanguard would redistribute a portion of the clawed-back shares to him as a performance bonus. If you sign these documents now, Sterling said, we will agree not to pursue civil litigation against you for the misuse of corporate assets. We will let you walk away without destroying your professional reputation. If you refuse, we will file a lawsuit in Cook County Circuit Court tomorrow morning, and we will make sure every healthcare provider in the state knows you compromised security protocols. The room was silent, save for the hum of the air conditioner. They thought they had backed me into a corner. They thought a veteran software developer would be terrified of a lawsuit and would sign away his $15 million in shares just to avoid a fight. I looked at the documents. I knew that fighting a private equity firm in court would take years and cost hundreds of thousands of dollars. They had unlimited resources. I did not. Even if I won, the company would be hollowed out by the time the litigation ended. But I also knew something they had completely overlooked. In their rush to acquire the company and seize control, their due diligence team had focused entirely on the client contracts and the physical assets. They had assumed that the software we used was fully owned by the corporation. I picked up my pen. So you are terminating my employment today, effective immediately? I asked. Yes, Sterling said, a smug grin appearing on his face. Effective at 5 o'clock today. You will have 10 minutes to gather your personal items. Security will escort you from the building. And you are invoking the clawback clause for my shares? We are, Arthur Vance replied. The $1 payment will be wired to your account by tomorrow morning. Understood, I said. I signed the termination acknowledgement. I did not sign the share repurchase agreement, as they could not force me to sign that without a separate arbitration, but the termination itself was what they needed to trigger the process. I pushed the signed acknowledgement back to Arthur. I stood up, closed my laptop, and placed it in my leather bag. I looked at David one last time. Good luck running the transaction logs without me, David, I said quietly. We have a team of 20 offshore engineers taking over your repository access tonight, Julian. Sterling sneered. I think we will manage just fine without your outdated methods. Now, please leave. I walked out of the conference room, escorted by a security guard who looked embarrassed to be there. I walked to my desk, packed my notebook, my coffee mug, and my personal key ring. I did not say goodbye to anyone. I walked out of the office and into the rain. I took the train back to my apartment in Lincoln Park. As the city lights flickered through the water-streaked windows, I opened my phone and accessed my personal email archive. I found the PDF of the patent license agreement we signed in 2018. I scrolled down to Clause 14C. This license shall immediately terminate, and all rights granted hereunder shall revert to the licensor, if the licensor's employment with the licensee is terminated for any reason other than voluntary resignation. I smiled. They had fired me at 4:45 p.m. The clock was ticking. In exactly 10 days, on the next Monday, their license to use the MetaRoute algorithm would expire, and I had no intention of renewing it. Friday morning, I woke up early, poured a cup of black coffee, and sat down at my desk. My personal laptop was connected to my home network. I did not access the CrossHealth servers. I did not need to. I had signed my termination agreement, and my corporate accounts had already been deactivated. I could see that my access to the corporate Slack and the AWS console had been revoked at 5:30 p.m. the previous evening, but I did not need corporate access to enforce my intellectual property rights. I opened the United States Patent and Trademark Office database. My patent, U.S. Patent 9,843,211, was active and in good standing. I had paid the maintenance fees personally every year. Next, I opened the digital copy of the patent license agreement. I drafted a formal legal notice addressed to Sterling Thorne, chairman of the board of CrossHealth Solutions, and David Vance, CEO. The letter was brief and precise. It stated that as of April 14, 2026, my employment with CrossHealth Solutions had been terminated by the employer. Consequently, pursuant to Section 14C of the Patent License Agreement dated September 12, 2018, the non-exclusive license granted to CrossHealth Solutions to utilize the patented MetaRoute database routing architecture was terminated. Under the terms of the agreement, I was required to provide a 10-day cure period. If the company did not cease and desist all use of the patent technology or negotiate a new license agreement within 10 business days, they would be in willful infringement of federal patent law. The cure period would expire at midnight on April 27, 2026. I printed 3 copies of the letter. I walked down to the post office and sent them via certified mail with return receipt requested. One went to the corporate office, one to Vanguard Capital's headquarters in New York, and one directly to David Vance's home address in Lake Forest. I knew how Sterling Thorne would react. He would hand the letter to Arthur Vance, who would laugh and tell him that patent disputes take years to resolve. They would assume I was bluffing, or that they could tie me up in litigation while they continued to use the software. They did not understand how the system actually worked. The MetaRoute software did not just run on their servers. It was integrated into the core API gateway that connected CrossHealth to the clearinghouses. The algorithm was responsible for formatting the data payloads before they were sent to the insurance companies. More importantly, I had a second layer of security that was entirely separate from the patent. When I built the original MetaRoute system, I set up a dedicated validation server to handle the real-time HIPAA compliance checks. Because of the strict federal regulations regarding patient data security, this server had to be hosted in a highly secure environment. At the time, CrossHealth did not have the capital to rent a dedicated physical server in a Tier 4 data center. So, I rented the server space personally, using my own credit card and registering the account under my private development company, CrossTech Consulting. I then leased the validation server space to CrossHealth on a month-to-month basis. This was documented in a service agreement signed by David Vance in 2019. The data center was located in a secure facility in downtown Chicago. The servers housed the primary encryption keys and the validation databases that verified the claim payloads. Without access to this validation server, the main CrossHealth application could not process any transactions. It would return a 503 service unavailable error to the hospitals, as it could not complete the mandatory HIPAA compliance checks. The service agreement for the validation server had a change of control clause. It stated that if CrossHealth Solutions underwent a change of control without the written consent of CrossTech Consulting, the lease would terminate and all access to the validation server would be revoked after a 10-day notice period. I had never enforced this clause when Vanguard acquired the company because I wanted to keep my job and my shares. But now, they had fired me. They had triggered the default. I drafted a second letter this time from CrossTech Consulting. I notified Cross Health Solutions that due to an unauthorized change of control and the subsequent termination of my employment, the hosting service agreement was terminated. I gave them 10 days to migrate their validation databases off my servers. The migration deadline was also midnight on April 27. I sent this second letter via certified mail as well. Over the weekend, I did nothing. I read books, walked along the lakefront, and enjoyed the quiet Chicago spring. I knew that the certified letters would arrive on Tuesday morning. On Tuesday afternoon, my phone started ringing. The caller ID showed David Vance's personal cell phone. I did not answer. He left a voicemail. "Julian, it's David. I got your letters. Look, we need to talk. This patent thing, we assigned all the IP when we incorporated. Arthur says your license agreement is superseded by the IP assignment. And this server lease, you can't just shut down the validation server. That's company property. Call me back." I listened to the voicemail and deleted it. An hour later, my phone rang again. This time it was an office number from New York. It was Arthur Vance. I let it go to voicemail. "Mr. Cross, this is Arthur Vance, Corporate Counsel for Cross Health. We have received your correspondence regarding the patent license and the hosting agreement. We advise you that any disruption to the services of Cross Health Solutions will result in immediate legal action, including an injunction and damages for tortious interference. We suggest you have your attorney contact us immediately." I did not call him back. I did not need an attorney yet. I knew exactly where I stood. The IP assignment they relied on covered all works made for hire during employment. But the patent application for the MetaRoot algorithm had been filed 4 months before I became an employee of Cross Health Solutions. It was pre-existing intellectual property. The patent license agreement was the only legal document granting them the right to use it. They had the source code, yes. But they did not have the right to run it. And they certainly did not own the physical servers in the Chicago data center. On Wednesday, I received a formal letter via email from Arthur Vance, threatening to file a temporary restraining order in federal court if I did not sign a waiver of my patent claims. I forwarded the email to a veteran patent litigator I had hired on Friday, a sharp attorney named Sarah Jenkins. I wrote a short message. "Sarah, here is their threat. Please file our response and our counterclaim for patent infringement effective next Monday." Sarah replied within 10 minutes. "With pleasure, Julian. We are ready." The chess pieces were in place. The 10-day cure period was ticking away. David and Sterling were about to learn the difference between managing assets and understanding how those assets actually operated. The real panic set in on the following Monday, April 27. The 10-day cure period was set to expire at midnight. At 9:30 a.m., my phone rang. It was David Vance. I answered this time. "Julian, thank God you picked up," David said, his voice shaking. "We're in a massive bind here. The offshore team we hired, they tried to deploy an update to the transaction router last night to bypass the validation server. The whole system crashed. We've been down for 5 hours. The hospital group in Indiana is threatening to pull their contract. We're losing $80,000 an hour." "I told you, David," I said calmly, sitting on my balcony with a cup of coffee. "The validation server handles the compliance handshakes. If you bypass it, the insurance API rejects the payload because the encryption headers don't match. Your offshore team can't rewrite that logic because the validation code is compiled and patented." "Julian, please. We can work this out," David pleaded. "Sterling is willing to talk. We can renegotiate your consulting fee. We'll pay you a monthly retainer to keep the validation server active." "I'm not interested in a consulting fee, David. You and Sterling fired me for cause to steal my shares. You told me my methods were outdated. That was Sterling's idea." David stammered. "He's the one who pushed for the clawback. I had to go along with it." "You chose to dilute your shares to bypass our deadlock, David. You sold the company out to predators. Now you have to live with the consequences. What do you want, Julian? Just tell me what it takes to keep the servers running." "I want what is mine," I said. "I want my shares fully vested and paid out at the acquisition valuation of $15 million. And I want the lawsuit against me dropped. Until I see a signed settlement agreement and the wire transfer in my account, the validation server will go offline at midnight tonight. And on Tuesday morning, Sarah Jenkins will file the patent infringement lawsuit. 15 million? David gasped. Vanguard will never agree to that. They don't have that kind of cash on hand for a buyout. They plan to pay you in stock options after the public offering. Then they should have thought about that before they fired me, I said. You have 14 hours, David. Goodbye. I hung up before he could reply. By noon, the situation had escalated. I received an email from Sterling Thorne himself. The tone was no longer arrogant. It was formal but desperate. Julian, the email read, we have reviewed the hosting agreement for the validation server. We are willing to purchase the server hardware and the lease from Crosstech Consulting for $300,000. We will also grant you a non-voting board seat and a consulting contract of $200,000 per year. Let us resolve this professionally. I forwarded the email to Sarah. No deal, I told her. At 3 p.m., Arthur Vance attempted to file for an emergency temporary restraining order in the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Illinois. He argued that my threat to shut down the validation server would cause irreparable harm to healthcare providers and patients. Sarah Jenkins was waiting for them. She presented the judge with the signed service agreement from 2019, which clearly showed that Crosstech Consulting was an independent entity and that the agreement could be terminated upon a change of control. She also presented the patent registration documents, proving that the MetaRoute algorithm was owned by me personally, not the corporation. The judge refused to grant the restraining order. He ruled that CrossHealth was a commercial entity and that this was a contract dispute, not a public utility emergency. He noted that the company had had 10 days to migrate their systems and had failed to do so. The plaintiff cannot claim irreparable harm when they created the circumstances of their own emergency by terminating the developer who owned the technology. The judge wrote in his decision, when the news of the judge's ruling reached LaSalle Street, the panic turned into absolute chaos. At 5 p.m., the Indiana Hospital Group officially suspended their contract with CrossHealth, citing system instability and breach of SLA agreements. They represented 15% of our revenue. By 7 p.m., the Illinois Medical Consortium sent a formal notice warning that they would route their transactions through our competitor if the system was not fully operational by Tuesday morning. My phone was ringing every 2 minutes. David, Sterling, Arthur Vance, even David's brother, Ryan. I blocked all their numbers. At 11:30 p.m., I sat at my computer. I opened the terminal and logged into the administration console for the validation server at the Chicago data center. I watched the traffic logs. Hundreds of thousands of XML payloads were streaming through the server, validate route, record. I looked at the system clock, 11:59 p.m. I ran the shutdown script I had prepared. Sudo ctl stop crosshealth validator certus, sudo ctl disable crosshealth validator certus, shredo cc ros health, keys of tt2. The screen flickered. The traffic logs stopped. The encryption keys were securely deleted from the validation server's local storage. The system was dead. At 12:15 a.m., I checked the public status page for CrossHealth Solutions. The indicator light for the transaction gateway turned red. Below it, the message read, System outage. Our engineering team is actively investigating the issue. I closed my laptop, turned off the lights, and went to bed. For the first time in 8 years, I slept for 8 hours straight. Tuesday morning, the fallout was catastrophic. I woke up to a barrage of emails and news alerts. The regional tech blog had already picked up the story. CrossHealth Gateway goes dark, leaving thousands of medical claims in limbo. At 9 a.m., Sarah Jenkins called me. Julian, they're breaking, she said, her voice filled with satisfaction. I just got a call from Vanguard's lead counsel. Sterling Thorne wants to meet at our offices at noon. They have a settlement proposal. They want you there. Are they bringing a certified check? I asked. They're bringing a structured settlement agreement. I told them we won't even sit down unless they agree to the $15 million valuation as the baseline. They agreed. I'll be there, I said. At noon, I walked into the conference room at Sarah's firm. Sterling Thorne looked like he hadn't slept in 48 hours. His suit was wrinkled, his tie was slightly crooked, and the smug arrogance had completely vanished from his face. David Vance sat next to him, looking hollowed out. Arthur Vance was there too, looking at a stack of documents with a grim expression. Sterling didn't waste time. Julian, we need the validation server back online immediately. The Illinois Consortium has given us until 5 p.m. to restore services, or they are terminating their contract and suing us for damages. The bank has already notified us that our corporate credit line is frozen due to the breach of contract. We are facing a total collapse. Then you should sign the settlement, I said, sitting down opposite him. Arthur Vance slid the document across the table. Here are the terms. Vanguard Capital will purchase your 49% shareholding in Cross Health Solutions for $15 million. $5 million will be paid via wire transfer today. The remaining $10 million will be paid in quarterly installments over the next 2 years, secured by Vanguard's corporate assets. I looked at Sarah. She shook her head. No, Arthur, Sarah said. We want the full $15 million paid today. We are not accepting a structured payout from a private equity firm that might be bankrupt in 6 months. And we want a full release of all claims against Julian, including a formal statement from the board retracting the allegations of misconduct. $15 million in cash today is impossible, Sterling shouted, slamming his hand on the table. We don't keep that kind of liquidity in this fund. We would have to liquidate assets from other portfolio companies. Then I suggest you start liquidating, I said. Every hour my server is offline, the value of Cross Health drops. By tomorrow morning, you won't have a company left to save. You'll just have $30 million in lawsuits from hospital groups. David Vance looked at Sterling. Sterling, please. Just pay him. We're going to lose everything. The bank is going to default on the mortgage for the LaSalle office. Sterling glared at David, then turned back to me. His jaw clenched so hard I thought his teeth might break. He looked at Arthur Vance, who slowly nodded. There was no other option. They had no backup system, no legal recourse, and no time. Fine, Sterling spat out. We will transfer the $15 million, but we want the database keys and the validation service restored the minute the wire is confirmed. Once the funds are cleared in my account, I said, I will hand over the validation server access credentials. But the patent license for MetaRoute is a separate issue. I am not selling the patent. I will grant Cross Health a new, non-exclusive license, but the rate is no longer $1 a year. It will be $500,000 per year, payable in advance on January 1st. Sterling looked like he was about to explode. That's extortion. That's the market rate for a proprietary routing system that keeps your $22 million company alive, I replied. You can accept it, or you can spend the next 2 years trying to write a new algorithm from scratch while your clients leave. It's your choice. They spent the next 2 hours finalizing the paperwork. At 2:30 p.m., Sarah received confirmation from her bank. The wire transfer of $15 million had cleared. The funds were secure. I signed the settlement agreement and the new patent license. In return, I received the signed board resolution retracting all allegations of misconduct and restoring my reputation. I opened my laptop, logged into the data center console, and ran the script to restore the validation server. I loaded the backup encryption keys from my secure USB drive. Sudo's tail start Cross Health Valder service. Within seconds, the traffic logs resumed. The transaction gateway turned green on the status page. The system was running again. I closed my laptop, stood up, and shook hands with Sarah. I didn't look at Sterling or David. They were yesterday's news. 3 months later, Vanguard Capital sold their stake in Cross Health Solutions to a larger competitor at a massive loss. The system outage and the public dispute had damaged the company's valuation, and the new $500,000 annual patent licensing fee cut deep into their profit margins. David Vance was ousted as CEO by the new owners and is currently embroiled in litigation with Vanguard over his diluted shares. As for me, I bought a quiet house in northern Michigan, overlooking Lake Michigan. I spent my mornings walking on the beach and my afternoons working on new software projects. I still receive my $500,000 patent license check every year. Sometimes, when I'm coding on my porch, I think about the day they fired me. They thought they were the chess masters, and I was just a piece on the board. They forgot that without the engineer who built the machine is just a pile of expensive scrap metal.